Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Donaher, and I'm responsible for client services here at Radius. Thanks to all of you for your interest and for attending today's webinar, which will be on best practices around refreshing your brand health program with some new thoughts and ideas that we've put together for what I think you'll find is a very interesting framework. Today's webinar will be led by two of our senior people here, Mike Patterson, so Chief Research Officer, and Glenn Stada, the Senior Vice President. As always with our webinars, we have scheduled 45 minutes. If you'd like to, please type a question as we're going along. If you'd like to ask Mike or Glenn, what we'll do is the guys will speak for about 30 minutes, and hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes at the end. So any questions that you've got, I'll collate those. I'll group together any that are quite similar, but we can have some Q&A at the end of it. So by way of introduction, and during today's webinar, among other things, you'll certainly come away with an enhanced understanding, rather, of what motivated us to break the traditional brand health model, how we then take brand health framework and move that through to activation, so activation strategies that'll help you differentiate in the marketplace, and then also some deep insights that will provide a foundation for long-term brand growth. And so, as an introduction to today's speakers, first of all, Glenn. Glenn is an SVP at Radius and is based in Princeton, New Jersey. In addition to leading his own client service team here, Glenn also leads up our financial services sector, bringing his years of experience to clients in that industry. Glenn lives in Montgomery Township in New Jersey with his wife, Joellen. And one of the things that they love to do when they're traveling around the country and around the world is wherever they're going in the city that they happen to be in, they love to try and sample local cuisine, which is a real passion for them. Mike Patterson. Mike is Chief Research Officer here at Radius. Mike built his own business before merging that into the Radius family a number of years ago, and having previously worked on both the supplier and the client side of the business. Mike lives in Texas, loves to play golf when he's not involved in developing some unique advanced analytic techniques for us, including in the world of AI, which has taken up a lot of Mike's time just now. And so with that brief introduction, I will turn it over to Glenn.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Before we get started going over what's comprised within the brand health framework, I'd like for you, Mike, to maybe tell us a little bit about the history and how it was developed.
Yeah. Oops. There we go. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us, as Paul and Glenn have said. So when we developed this framework, what we first did is we assembled a team here at Radius, a core team of experts that had a lot of experience in terms of brand health. And we got together, we developed some ideas just in terms of best practices that we had seen, best measures, best approaches, etc. to use. And then we also conducted a very extensive literature review. So we looked at textbooks, journal articles, even competitive information. And so took all of that information together, compiled it together, and came up with a tentative brand tracking framework. And then what we wanted to do was to test that. And so we conducted a large-scale US-based survey that covered 57 brands, and that was across 6 different categories or industries. And once we'd gotten those data back, we performed a variety of different statistical analyses to test and modify the framework so that we could identify which measures worked best and how those measures interplayed with one another. And then essentially what we ended up with, we think, is a framework that is both extremely actionable as well as very statistically sound and robust.
Mike, what are those key metrics that make the Radius Brand Health Framework useful for firms?
Yeah, so our framework really takes a holistic view of brand health by looking at how a brand is performing across a continuum of different experiences that a buyer can have with the brand. And so starting on the left hand of this chart, you can see we begin by understanding how salient a brand is in a consumer's mind. Then we move to understanding how the brand is perceived across different dimensions. We then assess the preference for the brand overall, as well as in relation to competitive brands. And then finally, we look at the strength of connection that audiences might have with a brand.
Mike, I think it could be useful to go into a little bit more detail about the specific components of the framework, as some of these elements I know are not included in some of the legacy trackers that I'm working on with my client base.
Sure. Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll start with the left-hand side. There we go. So we'll start with brand salience. And brand salience really measures the extent to which brands are thought of easily and often, at the right time, the right place, and in the desired or intended ways that a company wants it to. And brand salience really focuses on the availability and recognition heuristics that have been derived from behavioral science. And that is namely that brands that come to mind very easily are generally more positively viewed and are also just much more likely to be selected or purchased. And you can see on this slide that we list the different measures that we typically would include. So aided awareness, unaided awareness, familiarity, and then past purchasing behaviors. And we can take those measures in combination to understand the extent to which a brand really distinguishes itself in what otherwise could be a very crowded marketplace. So the next dimension that we have really deals with brand performance, and includes measures that really hone in on the perception of different functional attributes. And this allows us to tease out how a brand performs on these more concrete, rational items. And as we note here, this taps into System 2 measures, which really try and assess how a buyer thinks about brands in terms of cognitive evaluative processing. So Glenn, when we're talking about these types of attributes, what do you think the best way is in order to capture perceptions of functional attributes?
Sure, yeah, when we're able to design a new study from scratch, we tend to prefer association questions where a respondent will tell us across a selection of brands that we want to measure in the study, the extent to which on each dimension, they would associate each of those brands with it. So they could pick as many brands as they want that they believe are represented by that dimension, or they can pick as few. There's also a none. So this really gives us the ability to not stress the respondent in terms of having to evaluate brands that they may not have experience with on attributes across a scale. It's simply kind of yes, you associate, or no, you don't. And this data allows us to, over time, we've found it to be a very reliable way of looking at leverageable strengths by brand, opportunities to improve by brand, and also identify white space, those areas where really none of the brands are owning a certain dimension. Moving past functional attributes, our approach also includes a clever way and potentially a new way to measure emotional attributes. Mike, do you want to provide a little more detail on that?
Yeah, we definitely believe that there's real value in measuring the feelings that consumers may have with a brand. And so we have a variety of different emotional measures that ask consumers how a brand makes them feel, the imagery that they associate with the brand. And examples that come to my mind are things such as a brand you can trust, being an ethical company, it's a brand that values their customers, things like that. We also have a variety of different personality measures that we often will include in brand tracking surveys. And these are designed to assess how consumers perceive a brand across a variety of different dimensions. So, is the brand perceived as being caring or hip and cool, or maybe a funny sort of brand? And as you see on this slide, we list System 1, which really gets at those decisions that are more subconscious in nature, that consumers may not be aware of. And we find that using System 1 approaches to measurement in combination or conjunction with emotional measures really will yield some very nice results. And then also on this slide, we list System 3. And this is sort of a new framework of measurement that tries to get at more imaginative measures that really have respondents kind of project their feelings and their behaviors into the future that allow us to understand how they view a brand. So the next dimension that we measure is preference. And this is both for the brand that our client brand that we're focused on, as well as competitive brands. And within this construct, what we like to do is assess high-level preferences that might include things such as overall appeal, value perceptions, the extent to which a company is seen as innovative, and as well as kind of the momentum behind a brand. Is it seen as kind of an up-and-coming brand on the way up, or is it seen as a brand that might be declining in terms of perceptions? And then we also like to understand the strength of consideration. So in this case, we assess the likelihood to consider the brand as well as that of competitors. And then with these measures, we can come to an understanding of the share of preference that a brand might have. So understand the extent to which a brand stands alone and really distinguishes itself versus it's just simply one of many in a consumer's mindset. So the next level that we associate and assess is brand resonance. And this is the highest level within our framework. And it is composed of a variety of different measures. So on this slide, we show loyalty. The next, we'll also talk about brand connectivity. But when we assess loyalty, we really focus on that positive word of mouth that consumers will provide, as well as trying to understand the extent to which they desire to return to or repurchase a brand.
Mike, I've seen cases where many satisfied and seemingly loyal customers don't always purchase from that brand in the future. How does our framework consider that or take that in?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we also measure brand connectivity because I think you're right, Glenn. Oftentimes we find that a customer may be loyal, but it's not a strong loyalty necessarily. And so what we try and understand is how connected, how strong is the relationship that a consumer or a buyer might have with the brand. And so this idea of brand connectivity incorporates several different measures. So as we show here, we assess the affection that they might have towards the brand, the passion that they might exhibit, as well as the extent to which they feel connected, say, to others that are also using the brand. So a good example on this last one is Harley-Davidson, who has this large community of very vibrant owners who really love and are passionate about their brand. So for each of these, we assess these sub-measures using a variety of different questions to really hone in and understand at a very tactical level and strategic level both how consumers feel about each of these dimensions.
And earlier, Mike, you mentioned System 3 measurement, and I suspect that is a new concept to many and something that's a bit differentiating for our model. Could you go into a little more detail on what System 3 is?
Yeah. As I mentioned, it is a relatively new measure, and it's also very forward-looking. So it's a forward-looking, imaginative measure that asks respondents to project how they think they would feel in different circumstances. So, for example, when they're actually purchasing a product, or a product or maybe a service, how do they think they would feel when they're making that purchase? Or when they're using a product, how do they think they would feel? Or, sort of looking outside of themselves, how do they think that others would view them, knowing that they've purchased a product? Or how would others view them when they see them using the product? So again, very projective sorts of measures.
So, Mike, I think you've done a good job of laying out the components of the model across the spectrum and all of the underlying metrics that we're asking of the brands within any category. Can you tell us how that all comes together to get an overall assessment of brand health?
Sure. Yeah, we really believe that there's a lot of value in summarizing brand health using a single metric. And so what we've done is we've tested a variety of different approaches, different ways of using the measures that we've talked about in order to construct a composite overall brand health measure. And with all of that testing, we've identified the measures shown on this slide as being the most robust and those measures being the most reliable. And so what we'll do is we'll take salience, preference, and loyalty connectivity and combine those into an overall measure of brand health. And that allows you to compare how your brand is doing vis-a-vis the competition. But then we're also able to provide very targeted information about how to make improvements. So let's say that your brand health score is average, that you're on par with many other brands. Well, should you look to improve in terms of salience, or perhaps you're lagging in terms of preference or loyalty connectedness? So our model and approach allow us to really provide that very diagnostic and detailed information. So Glenn, I know that you've got clients that have programs that include some sort of a brand health score. Can you tell us how they typically work with their brand health scores in order to drive their business forward?
Yeah, one very useful and actionable way that our clients are working with brand health scores are to model the expected results of improvements across the range of whatever functional, emotional, or underlying indicators we include in the study. So oftentimes one of the deliverables will be a brand health simulator. An example of one is here on the screen, and this is an Excel-based tool that allows the user, the end client, their stakeholders, the ability to conduct what-if scenarios to determine how improvement on one or several dimensions might impact those kind of key outcomes. So it could be overall brand health score, it could be the salience measure, it could be the connectivity measure. So whatever dependent variables we build the simulator to, and typically we'll do that on a custom basis, understanding the wants and wishes of the client, this tool then uses statistical modeled results to understand that interplay and that relationship between the underlying measures and that overall brand health score that we're managing to.
So as we mentioned earlier, we did conduct a self-funded study when we were trying to develop and refine our brand health model. And as I mentioned, large study, multitude of different sectors. One of the sectors was finance, and we covered a variety of different brands, which you can see here. And so, Glenn, I know that, as Paul alluded to, you've got a lot of experience in financial services. So I think it would be great if you could walk us through how the results of our brand health framework can be used, focusing specifically on those financial services companies.
Sure. Yeah, Mike, if you want to take it to the next slide, we're blinding the scores here across those brands that Mike just mentioned, just so people don't get distracted on which bank's winning, which bank's losing. But what we did was we took the several hundred responses that we got within financial services, and we framed it to retail banking. So we ran all the measures that we talked about. We did all the modeling that we talked about, and we came up with a brand health score for each of the brands. This is indexed to 100. So 100 essentially is the average brand health score. But what's neat about this is you can see the array from brand 1 to brand 9, and it's quite a distinction in terms of the differentiation. So what's nice about this is it gives us the ability to really look at kind of a wide range of outcomes, and not every brand is clustered in the same space. So of course, this then is one measure that a brand can now socialize within their organization, get everybody, the key leaders, to understand the score, and they can manage that moving forward. So for this example of financial services, this brand health score then leads to the next slide, where we've got then the underlying parts of the spectrum, the brand health spectrum that Mike introduced, and we can start to diagnose for each brand where there are strengths or weaknesses across salience, preference, and then that loyalty, connection, higher level of brand strength. And again, you'll see different situations by brand. It's not the case that a brand is strong across all of them. I mean, definitely for some of them, they're over 100 for all of them, but you'll see kind of a different situation for the brands. And I'll get into that a little bit with some custom summary examples. But this allows us to, on a case-by-case basis, really start with the diagnosis on, okay, here's where your brand health is. If you're looking to improve, these are the areas to focus. Mike, on the next page, yeah, this is just an example using the functional attributes. Again, when we do this real for our clients on a custom basis, we've got the functional, we've got the emotional attributes. We're using the various techniques like System 1. But for this study, we've got the functional attributes that we had the respondents associate to each of the brands that they're aware of. And then we ran a regression model to the overall brand health score, so we could get a prioritization of which functional attributes have the most impact on brand health. And in this case, within financial services, it was definitely those customer-centric measures, the ability to reach a live rep, the ability the ease to do business and customer service. So we now have laid out what the primary drivers of a brand health. We can then move forward, and I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, but each of these individual plots represent the association scores for each of the brands on each of the attributes. So then if we are working for a specific brand as our client, we're going to look at where they come in right now on each of these attributes, starting with those that are most important and working the way down, and looking at where they're positioned relative to peers, looking at the distribution of the line from high score to low score. That tells us a little bit about the diversity of perceptions on that attribute. And then we'll also, we're not showing it here, but we'll look at the percentage that said none. None of the brands that we tested are associated with this dimension, and that helps us to start to uncover white space, especially those attributes that tend to be more important but have fewer associations. Those are kind of meaningful opportunities to own dimensions that will link statistically to brand health. Now, this is just a little example of the analysis that we do, but we definitely have a lot more richness that we would include in typical programs.
Yeah. So Glenn, I think it could be helpful if you could talk about some of the story and maybe the opportunity that might be available to some of the brands that we've included in this analysis.
Sure, yeah. So if you go to the next page, Mike, so our hypothetical brand 2, we know it is a real brand, but we're masking it. So based on what we've seen here, and again, there's other data that we're using to diagnose how the brands are doing, more than what we had time to show you. But this brand 2, we would say to them, they're positioned to win by maintaining one of the healthiest financial services brands in the US. So their brand health score was 119. So second out of 9, definitely strong. When we start to break down the components to look at where they can drive further, we find they are the most salient brand in the market. So definitely very, very well known. But when we look at, and likely when we look at other measures, we see it's driven by a large customer base, but preference among the market at large is more muted. And we can tie that to more moderate perceptions of value to those that are not yet working with that bank or brand. Additionally, we're able to look and see that they're leading most significantly on perceptions related to convenience, easy to use mobile app, a great online experience, but they're only moderately perceived as handling customer data responsibly. So for a brand like this, we'd be able to give them some recommendations in terms of concerning loyalty programs, really kind of help to drive customers into that loyal connectivity space, attract new customers, personalized offers, multi-product benefits, and potentially a campaign on data integrity. So that'd be one example. If you go to the next one, Mike, so this is brand 5, and they were kind of right in the middle on brand health. But we would say for them that we've seen them establish strong salience in the marketplace, but they're going to be challenged to achieve meaningful growth until they improve perceptions that will drive trial and deeper customer connection. So what we found is they're very well known nationally, only lagging the 3 largest brands in terms of awareness and familiarity, but loyalty and connection was merely average. So very well known, but loyalty and connection was more similar to the lesser known brands. We also saw that perceptions were more on the weaker side on convenience, access to customer service. So for this brand, we would recommend potentially product and service improvements, targeted marcom campaigns, better use of tech to show needs that needs are met without a wide branch network. And that comes from some other analysis we did that we haven't had time to show here. Finally, the third and last example, this is brand 7. So the assessment here is this brand punches above its weight due to a best-in-class customer experience model. This has the bank position to grow should it choose to diversify and expand its traditional target. So while the brand overall on brand health comes out 7th out of 9 at 90, there is a very strong preference among those that know the brand and use the brand. We also see that brand 7 is a favorite brand often, and there's very high scores for customer service and value relative to cost. So we see this as a situation where that salience number at 56, that really is the biggest thing holding this brand back. You know, go out there, you're positioned to grow if you want to make a play. So we just picked these three as an example of how this framework could have the same inputs, but have outputs in terms of a story that differs for three different brands. And obviously this was financial services, but this model works really well across many of the sectors that all of you on the phone are part of. So yeah, at this point, I'll turn it over to Paul, and he can jump in and maybe lead some questions and see what everyone has to say.
Thanks, guys. Got a number of questions, actually. Some of them I'll try and sort of combine a little bit, as I usually do as well, as people have kind of asked similar things in slightly different ways. A number of people are asking about B2B versus B2C. And do we think about brand health, or is the framework set up differently to take account of B2B versus B2C? But I think a lot of people are curious as to how we think about using this framework, using this model, and the outputs that it can provide on B2B versus B2C, and get you guys comments on that.
Yeah. You want to go, Glenn? You want me to talk first?
Yeah, I can jump in first. So I've got about 40% of my clients are in the B2B space, a lot of that in terms of commercial banking and work with advisors. And the model is set up that the issues of salience, preference, loyalty, connection, will work for B2B. Some of the underlying choices that they may have, the underlying attributes are going to be different. But the idea of looking at where a brand is on a spectrum and a continuum, and kind of coming to a single score for brand health, in my experience, it works just as well in the B2B space.
Yeah, I think that's true. Some of the wording and the approach that we'll take to some of the measures is going to have to be custom and modified. Some of the measures may not work quite as well, kind of those connectivity or community sort of measures. But really it depends on the industry. But what we've kind of shown time and time again, when we'll conduct a B2B study, do the modeling, we find that the models work really well, that we have very good model fit. So yeah, I think it's applicable both to B2B as well as B2C.
Yeah, agreed. And I think I would also just add one element to that. We often can make some assumptions that there might be more emotion tied to decisions around B2C and more functional elements applied to B2B, but we've always seen, depending on the sector or the industry, we've always seen that is a balance, and that there is often just as much emotion and decisions around B2B and really just as much functional requirement around B2C as well. So the two are often similar in that, although the balance will be different. One question, Mike, you sort of addressed this one. It's around, you mentioned sort of forward-facing versus backward-facing, understanding brand momentum, if you like. How do you sort of respond when, you might get asked by clients or internal stakeholders or other people who are involved in brand health work? This work is typically backward-facing. How can we make it more predictive, and how can we make it more forward-facing and get more prediction out of it for internal stakeholders?
Yeah, I think, and Glenn showed where we will develop our simulators. And so I think by conducting driver analysis and then putting all of this into these what-if simulators, it allows us to be more forward-looking. So establish, say, an overall goal for brand health, and then understand what is likely to happen in the future as we make improvements to specific areas. Are we likely to see, or what improvements are we likely to see in brand health? And so it allows you to kind of project out where you're going to be vis-a-vis those improvements. Glenn, do you have anything to add?
No, Yeah, I was going to say the same thing about the simulator tool. That's very much how we use it, to kind of be forward looking. We have programs that we swap out a section of questions at the end for topical information on a quarterly basis, and often those will be kind of forward looking type questions. Do you foresee having these needs in the future? Do you think this regulation is going to impact you? Based on the results that come in, we profile the people that say certain things are an issue. How are they feeling about brands versus others? So there's a lot that we can do that isn't just backward looking. And yeah, the fact that each of these programs, while using this framework, are custom, it gives us the ability to do that for certain sectors that forward looking may be more important.
Good. Appreciate that, guys. Question here on when sort of upturn or downswing on communication. So let's say if we know that a brand is going to go dark for a month or 2 weeks, and typically they're heavy spenders, or spend is increased, seasonality, and that might sort of have an effect on some of our KPIs. How do you guys take into account this current spend on communications, and how that might be, and how we might see KPIs be affected by that within any framework?
You want to answer, Glenn? You want me to?
Why don't you jump in first and then?
Yeah. So I find that there's real value in kind of continuous measurement, being in the field kind of throughout the year, just so that you can pick up any sort of nuances. But having said that, if a client comes and they know that they're going to have sort of heavy up periods at certain points in time, we might want to do some additional interviews, boost up our sample size, kind of pre and post, to see what impact those communications have. And then, as oftentimes we're doing some time series modeling where we might be looking at seasonality or other things. And one of those inputs then could be those advertisement campaigns or whatever sort of communication campaigns, so we can measure the impact.
Yeah, I'll just add that we have a mix of different cadences for trackers, some fast moving categories. We're in the field continuously for those reasons. Other B2B categories, sometimes that don't move as fast. It's okay to not be fielding continuously, especially those that have finite universes, and there aren't a million say CFOs out there that we can talk to. So we like to keep that cadence aligned. But to the point of this being a brand health framework, it's not just to measure the effectiveness of communications, it's to measure how your competitors are doing, tracking, trending, how things that are happening in the environment that you don't have an impact on are impacting your brand and other brands. So it speaks to not just designing the field work periods around when you're going to be spending the most.
I think that's good commentary, and always having a pulse on the competition of what's going on there as well, Glenn. Last question that I currently have is around a question that a brand has recently added some M&A activity, added some brands to their portfolio, and they have tracking work that they're currently doing. How would our framework, or how would we recommend taking account of brands that come into maybe a centralized insights team's purview that they didn't used to have, whether it's through purchase or just through another part of the business? How would our framework deal with added brands into the portfolio?
I mean, to me, it simply becomes another brand. So hopefully, in some cases, you've already had those established, those newly added brands within the tracking framework. But if not, it feels like you would simply add those into the brand list, because we're always measuring both our client brand as well as competitive brands, right? So we have those those benchmarks. And so I would add those in as additional brands that we would want to start to track.
Yeah, the only build on that I'd have is you also want to consider whether the brand has a different target. It extends your addressable market. Are these brands focused up market when maybe your brands weren't? So you may want to augment the sample, augment the, I don't know if there's a regional element, but kind of looking at what the new brands do, and is there a need to augment the sample plan? If that was the case, I'd probably recommend you keep the sample constructs that you have, so you're not messing with the trendability of your existing program, but you build on in a way that's a build that's complementary, but you've got the existing program kind of as a whole, and you can measure that.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. You have to be able to continue to track and trend, but using perhaps the idea of this as the benchmark wave of anything new that's coming into the program. Glenn. Well, look, that's all the questions that we have, folks. Thanks everybody for your time today. We'll send out a recording of this that you should feel free to share or listen back to. Feel free also to get in touch with us. We will be back with our webinar series in Q1 next year with some new thoughts, new topics, new ideas. But in the meantime, thanks everybody for your support in the webinars that we've had in 2024. And I hope everyone has a safe and happy holiday season. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.